The Bahá'í Faith started in 1844, and its name is due, of course, to its founder, Baha'u'llah, who was the founder of the Bahá'í Faith, who was born in Iran, Persia at the time, in 1817, and passed away in 1892 in Palestine, and currently that's the northern part of Israel. So Bahá'í Faith is the most recent independent world religion, is the second most geographically widespread religion in the world, and also ranked as one of the fastest growing in the world. Baha'is, who are followers of Baha'u'llah, are estimated to be anywhere between 7 and 8 million worldwide in more than 100,000 localities. Of course, the main belief of the Baha'is is that they recognize Baha'u'llah as the latest divine messenger, bringing a new revelation for this age of humanity, which is the maturity of humanity. And there are a lot of principles and things we're going to go over this. Nancy is going to give some more details, but it all goes around the unity of mankind and humanity reaching the age of maturity. Therefore, the Bahá'í Faith upholds three fundamental principles: the oneness of God, the oneness of religion, and the oneness of humanity. So let me go briefly through each one of those. So the oneness of God, we know from the dawn of history, existence of God or not existence of God, personal God, non-personal God, a God who created the universe and us and left us alone, or a God that intervenes all the time, has been the fundamental question moving the purpose of life and all these things. So Baha'u'llah, founder, mentions something very fundamental. Of course, it reaffirms the monotheistic approach by saying that God in his essence and his own self has ever been unseen, inaccessible, and unknowable. The key word here is essence. So the analogy I'm trying to give is that, again, to understand, is imagine we have a fantastic painting. No matter how the painting, how beautiful it is, and reflects the attributes of the painter, it can never comprehend the nature of the painter. The same analogy would be, in the same way, humans. We look at ourselves, we look at the universe, we haven't created ourselves. And if we believe in a creator, it's going to be very hard to understand the true nature of the creator. And again, in from the Baha'i writings, it says that God, the unknowable essence, the divine being, is immensely exalted beyond every human attribute, such as corporeal existence. God will remain in his reality, everlastingly hidden from the sight of men. Another quote from the Baha'i writings. Therefore, we have, before I go into the quote, we hear people say about God, who believes in God, the all bountiful, the all generous. And the Baha'i writings say that those attributes, we find there are things that are dear to us, like generosity. We find it's a good thing. Knowledge, it's a good thing. And since we believe that God is really all-powerful, so we come with this definition of God being the all-powerful, the all-knowledgeable. So that what we imagine is not the reality of God. He, the unknowable, the unthinkable, is far beyond the highest conception of man. So therefore, the question we can ask is, what then are we capable to know about God? And the answer is we get to know the attributes, not the essence, but the attributes and will of God through the divine messengers who have appeared throughout history, bringing guidance and teaching. And I've underlined something important, guidance and teaching that are needed for that particular time in the evolution of humanity. So there is a nice picture analogy in the Baha'i Faith, where the analogy is that, let's assume that, for a moment, because, we have to imagine that God is the sun here. And then we have this, what we call divine messengers, are the pure mirrors. And the attributes of God and are reflected in those pure mirrors. And we humans see the reflection. This is actually a beautiful analogy explaining the Trinity. Okay, when the mirror said, Father is in me, but it's not in me, but you can see itself. Here is also another quote reinforcing that image is, Baha'u'llah says, the door of the knowledge of the Ancient of Days, referring to God, being those closed in the face of all human, the source of infinite grace, has caused those luminous gems, the messengers of holiness, to appear out of the realm of the spirit in the noble form of the human temple and be made manifest unto all men. So therefore, we have the divine messengers coming. And if you look around the world, you see that the world is divided in different religions. Some get along, some don't. Some believe they're saved, others are doomed. Some say, well, mine is different from yours, mine is better. The key message that is needed today for the unity of mankind is to overcome that conception and embrace the oneness of religion. We have many divine messengers, but we have only one unfolding religion. And again, the analogy, we have God. The will of God is exactly one religion that is gradually unfolding. There is an evolution even in religion and the way it is revealed to us. And why is this gradually unfolding? Because it's helping the spiritual evolution of humanity. 6,000 years ago, the needs of society were not the same as when Moses appeared. It was not the same as when Jesus appeared. Were not the same as when Muhammad appeared. And the Baha'is say the needs of today and what we need as spiritual teaching have been brought by Baha'u'llah. And here, there have been many, many things. So here, if you look historically through, and this is not an exhaustive list, all these messengers, on the average, if you look, appear between every a period of 500 to 1,000 years. Baha'is believe that Bahá'í is the last one in this series, but there will be more in the future. One thing that is interesting to look at this is that each of these messengers provided guidance adapted to the needs of their time. And the other thing, if somebody goes and studies this with an open mind, they see that each one of them affirmed the divine origin of the previous one. Just for those who are from Judeo-Christian, if you look at Christ, Christ actually mentioned that Abraham, Noah, Moses believed in this. And even those who go and study Muhammad, the founder of Islam, recognize the divine origin of Christ. So each one of them recognizes who came before and promises either their own return or the coming of another one. And they all promised the coming of a day of God when the united humanity will live in peace. For Christians, that's essentially the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come and thy will be done here as it's done in heaven. So the concept in the Baha'i Faith is called progressive revelation. And again, another quote, it says, there is one religion, and this is the changeless faith of God, eternal in the past, eternal in the future. So we have one God, many lamps. These many divine messengers are special beings. They're not just normal humans, but they're neither God, they are somewhere in between. But they are all are the sources of the same light. And the founder of Baha'i Faith is, be lovers of light, regardless of where it's shining, which mirror is shining in, or which lamp it's coming from. And the Baha'i Faith, there is no difference between them. We don't say one is superior to the other. They are all reflecting the same light of God. What differs is the teachings they give at the time that we need those teachings. So in order to have the unity of humanity, of course, religion, we know, all of us, we know this, that religion historically has been a source of a lot of division. And even today, a lot of polarization in the world and suffering and violence. And Baha'u'llah is saying, the purpose of religion as revealed from the heaven of God's holy will is to establish unity and concord amongst the people of the world. And his strong advice, make it not the cause of dissension and strife. And here's a summary of what we mean, the Baha'is mean by the fundamental principles of the Baha'i. What do we say? That religious truth is not absolute, but relative. In what sense? It's relative to us, not that there is no absolute. It's relative to us, which means that depending on the time that religion came, it meant a lot for that time. Divine revelation is a continuous and progressive process. It doesn't stop. There's evolution. All the great religions of the world are divine in origin. The basic principles are in complete harmony. The basic principles are the existence of God. We are a spiritual being. There is a life after death, the golden rule. All these essential things, if you go in an unbiased way, you study all the religions, you're going to find they're the same. So what changes? Social rules that affect marriage, divorce, dietary rules, word you worship, the name of God, because there are different languages, different cultures in the past. Those were different. So their aims and purpose are one and the same: to teach us and show us the attributes and the will of God. Their teachings are but facets of one truth. Their functions are complementary. They differ only in the non-essential aspect of their doctrines, like I mentioned before, dietary things. You see, for example, again, another example, Moses was allowing the Mosaic thing, divorce was allowed, and there was the Sabbath. Then comes Jesus, and that's what they reproached him, is he nullified the Sabbath and said divorce is not allowed, and so forth. So those are the non-essential aspects of a religion. But if somebody looks in an unbiased way, they will see actually and be convinced that all religions are one. Their mission represents successive stages in the spiritual evolution of the human society. And that's the most important message about the oneness of religion. And now we come to the oneness of humanity. God, we need that today, or the divisions, and especially in this country, but all around the world. Okay, and Baha'u'llah enunciated this in the middle of the 19th century. The earth is but one country, and mankind its citizen. Today, the world needs an organic unity transcending divisions of race, nation, gender, social class, while celebrating its human diversity. Unity in diversity is very different from uniformity. And again, some quotes. So powerful is the light of unity that it can illuminate the whole earth. Ye are all leaves of one tree and the fruits of one branch. And one of the things that the founder of the Bahá'í Faith has insisted is on the racial and prejudice, which is of something that our countries are suffering, but other countries are. And there's a wonderful quote that I love. Addressing humanity, it says, "Know ye not why we created you all from the same dust, that no one should exalt himself over the other?" And here's my last slide on the oneness of humanity. So the unity of humanity, actually, if you look at this progressive thing that the religions have done, represents the consummation of human evolution. An evolution that has its earliest beginning in the birth of family life, its subsequent development, its achievement of tribal solidarity, the 12 tribes of Israel, leading to the constitution of city-states, and expanding later into the institution of independent and sovereign nations. And now we are entering, and this is what we Baha'is are saying, the Baha'i message essentially summarized, we're entering the phase of the unification of humanity promised by all the past religion. It's like a transition from adolescence to maturity. It's a tough time, even in our human beings. We're tempted by many things. That's why we see all the problems in the world. Baha'is are saying these problems are just transition towards this in the next step. And Baha'u'llah has brought all the necessary spiritual teaching and guidance for this stage of our collective evolution.
So briefly today, we will go through the life of Baha'u'llah. So as Shadon mentioned, throughout history, God has revealed himself to humanity through a series of divine messengers, each of whom has founded a great religion. Some of them have included Abraham, Krishna, Zoroaster, Moses, Buddha, Jesus, and Muhammad. The latest of these messengers is Baha'u'llah, who brings new spiritual and social teachings for our modern age. He taught us that there is only one God, that all of the world's religions are from God, and that now is the time for humanity to recognize the oneness, or the oneness of God and unite. Sorry, I need my inner 16-year-old to come. I'm not the best with technology, so we'll try and mud through this as best as we can. So the life of Baha'u'llah and the events associated with the birth of the new revelation from God unfolded in the 19th century in the Islamic world of Iran and the Ottoman Empire. The stern control of those two central powers dictated Baha'u'llah's movement his entire life, starting in what was then called Persia, where he was born. Baha'u'llah was born on November 12, 1817, in Tehran, Iran. He was the son of a wealthy government minister. Baha'u'llah led a princely life as a young man, receiving an education that focused mainly on calligraphy, horsemanship, classic poetry, and swordsmanship. And this is one of the, a picture of a modern picture, actually, of one of the homes that Baha'u'llah's family owned. According to the customs of the time, as the son of an influential government official, Baha'u'llah did not receive any formal education. Yet by the time he was 14, he became known for his learning. He would converse on any subject and solve any problems presented to him. In large gatherings, he would explain intricate religious questions to the leading religious figures in Islam, and they listened with great interest. After the death of his father, Baha'u'llah declined the ministerial career in the government that was available to him. Instead of pursuing a life of power and leisure, Baha'u'llah chose to devote his energies to a range of philanthropies which had, by the early 1840s, earned him renown as the father of the poor. Okay, now we'll get into the banishment from Iran. So his fame and influence in the corrupt surrounding caused the divines and high-ranking government officials to persecute, imprison, torture, and eventually exile him from Persia in order to quench the influence he was having on the suppressed society. The wicked Shah of Iran ordered him to leave for Baghdad, then a part of the Ottoman Empire. The regime of the Shah successfully pressed the Ottoman authorities to send him further and further away. Okay, in 1868, Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Bahá'í Faith, and some of his followers, about 70 men, women, and children, arrived in Akka, in then Palestine, on the northern coast of Israel. Akka was a heavily protected fortress city where Turkish troops were stationed, and was also the worst penal colony in the Turkish Empire. Baha'u'llah was a prisoner of the Sultan of Turkey. Now, it is said during those times that if a bird flew over this wretched city, that it would drop dead from the stench and filth that the city, that came from the city. Already, Baha'u'llah had suffered 16 years of imprisonment and an exile, first in his native land and then in Iraq and Turkey. For the remaining 24 years of his life, he would remain a prisoner in Akka. His sole crime was the extremely liberal, tolerant, and progressive message he taught. For this, he was tortured, put in chains, condemned to death, imprisoned, and exiled at the instigation of a fanatical clergy whose vengeance pursued him for 40 years. In the terrible heat of August, Baha'u'llah disembarked at the sea gate and entered as what he described as the most desolate city in the world, with a detestable climate and foul water. He was led by his guards through the narrow, stinky lanes, the object of a curiosity and mockery of its inhabitants, and finally arrived at the army barracks and entered the prison, which is on the top left. For 2 years and 2 months, Baha'u'llah and his companions were strictly confined in this inner citadel. After the first 2 years of confinement in the prison barracks, Baha'u'llah and his followers were moved to other buildings in Akka as gradually the power of his personality and the beauty of his character won the admiration of the officials. So from the time he was in Adrianople and continuing in Akka, Baha'u'llah addressed the kings and rulers of the world in uncompromising and momentous terms. Baha'u'llah announced his mission to the world's political and religious leaders, respectfully asked them to approach his message in a spirit of open-mindedness, summoned them to respond to his call, and admonished them to be just, to care for the poor in their midst, to reconcile their disputes, and to disarm and demilitarize their increasingly warlike nations. And here is just a small sample, if you will, of his writings to some of these rulers. Compose your differences and reduce your armaments, that the burden of your expenditures may be lightened, and that your minds and hearts may be tranquilized. Heal the dissensions that divide you, and you will no longer be in need of any armaments except what the protection of your cities and territories demanded. Now, all these letters are now in a compilation called Summons to the Lord of Hosts that folks can look into if you would like. Right. Although the sentence of life imprisonment was never repealed, after almost 10 years, the gate of the prison city was opened to Baha'u'llah. Now admired by high-ranking officials and revered by the populace, he was at last free to move about the countryside. Though still a prisoner till the end of his life, the years of strict confinement were now over. This is a modern view of the mansion in Baji that near Akka. In about 1880, Baha'u'llah's son rented this beautiful country home where Baha'u'llah spent much of the later years of his life, today the mansion of Baji. It was here that Baha'u'llah had a very important interview with Professor Edward Granville Brown of Cambridge University. And this is the first account of Dr. Brown's meeting with Baha'u'llah. Professor Brown wrote of his first meeting, "The face of him on whom I gazed, I can never forget, though I cannot describe it. Those piercing eyes seem to read one's very soul. Power and authority sat on that ample brow. No need to ask in whose presence I stood, as I bowed myself before one who is the object of a devotion and love which kings might envy and emperors sigh for in vain." In that same account, Baha'u'llah replied that all nations should become one in faith and all men as brothers, that the bonds of affection and unity between the sons of men should be strengthened, that diversity of religion should cease and difference of race be annulled. What harm is there in this? Yet show it shall be. These fruitless strifes, these ruinous wars shall pass away, and the most great peace shall come. Let not a man glory in this, that he loves his country. Let him rather glory in this, that he loves his kind. Baha'u'llah passed away on May 29th, 1892. A simple beauty surrounds Baha'u'llah's resting place. And this is the tomb in which Baha'u'llah is buried. From it, an almost tangible sense of peace flows out. His words echo in our ears. We desire but the good of the world and the happiness of the nations. Baha'u'llah's life in exile had come to an end here in Baji. Though still a political prisoner, the messenger of God was able to complete more than 100 volumes, a body of sacred writings dealing with a vast array of subjects. This wealth of divine guidance is centered on the principle of the oneness of humanity. It provides the blueprint for building a global civilization.
I'm going to share just some of the basic principles and teachings of Baha'u'llah, but I was just thinking, both when Shadin and Paul were talking about how it's been a pattern in the progressive revelation of God, that as each of the divine messengers has come, that they have all suffered in various ways to bring these unifying and educational teachings from God. And it's just one of the, difficulties that we don't embrace these things very easily. But the central teachings of Baha'u'llah are all centered around, as we said, this oneness of humanity. And that it's interesting that at the time when Baha'u'llah gave humanity these teachings, the world was very separated. I mean, we didn't have the capacity to travel easily. We didn't have any of the technology that we have, but in the 200-year period since the birth of Baha'u'llah, our planet has become one community. We now have the technology to be one world. And now what we need to do is catch our thinking up in how we look at our planet. And so these are the teachings of Baha'u'llah that will enable us to do that. So some of these have been mentioned before, but that humanity has been in this process of spiritual evolution, and that it's gone through its childhood and adolescence. And we have now really reached the threshold of our maturity as a human race, that we have always been one human race, but now we are at a point where we are mature enough to begin to operate that way, to come to grips with our oneness and create social institutions based on that. This idea of the independent investigation of truth, it's been mentioned a couple of times, and it's very important. One of the things that Baha'u'llah said was involved in the maturity of the human race is that there's no longer a need for a clergy. That in the past, a lot of humanity was illiterate. That's not true anymore, and that there does not need to be that kind of moderator between us and our God anymore. And so this God has made all of us both capable and responsible to investigate truth for ourselves, and that he has put inside every human being the ability to distinguish his voice when we hear it. Baha'u'llah also taught the nobility of every human being. He said, "Noble have I created you. Rise then for that. Rise then to that for which you were created." That we've been created in the image of God, as has been said in every religion. That we have these two natures. We have our kind of material nature and we have our spiritual nature. And that I guess you could say the battle or the work between those two natures is what we're all about, is learning to create our character around our spiritual nature. And then very central to this teaching of the oneness of humanity is both that we need to eliminate prejudice in our individual hearts and minds, but collectively, we need to create a society based on racial and social justice for all people, that we have outgrown a time. And really, it's becoming more and more evident that it's not a sustainable way to exist, to believe that some people are superior to others. And it's time to step up to justice as a human race. Also, part of the oneness of humanity is the equality of men and women. That Baha'u'llah said that men and women have always been and will always be equal in the sight of God. He said that men and women are like two wings of one bird, and that when they're both strong, the bird will fly. When one of the wings is not strong, the whole bird is grounded. He said that women must take an equal role in society, and that until that happens, world peace is not capable of happening. He also talked about the harmony between science and religion, that human beings have created a false dichotomy between these two things, that they are not meant to be in conflict, that they are two ways of searching for truth, and that religion without science is superstition, and that science without religion is materialism, and that we need both these ways of looking at truth, and that we really cannot solve our shared human problems in the world without both of these. He also said that we need to have universal education, and we're fortunate to live in a country where universal education is kind of a given. We don't, maybe we take it for granted, but in a lot of the world, this is not true. Not everyone is educated. There are women and girls in many places in the world who are not educated. There are people who are considered not deserving of an education, or that an education is wasted on them, or let's don't educate them so they stay in a lowered place. So this universal education is very much a part of the oneness of humanity. And it's also related to the fact that God has created us all noble. In fact, Baha'u'llah says, man is a mine rich in gems of inestimable value, and an education alone can cause it to reveal its treasures. So it's a really important teaching. That there are very unjust economic inequalities in the world, that the extremes of wealth and poverty that exist are an anathema to the oneness of humanity, that if we truly think of all of ourselves as one human family, we can't live with the kind of inequities that exist, and that there are spiritual ways to come to this, a more fair economic system. And then lastly, that all the religions of the past have promised that there would become a time in the future when we would have the kingdom of God on earth, when the lion would lie down with the lamb, that this has been a promise in all the religions. And that now, with humanity on the threshold of its maturity, and ready to create a society that's based on justice and equity, that we really can work toward world peace. And in fact, Baha'u'llah said, this is an inevitability, that this is the direction that the world is heading in. But we have to create it. It's not going to just happen to be handed to us on a platter. And then if you, an individual Baha'i or an individual human being has kind of a twofold purpose, according to the teachings of Baha'u'llah. First of all, that we need to be responsible for our own individual spiritual growth. And that means a lot of things. And this is kind of a summary, and I'm not really probably mentioning every single thing, but we live at this point in our lives in a material world that's kind of a workshop for developing spiritual qualities, but that there are worlds beyond this, that we have an immortal soul, and that when we are born into the next world, what we'll take with us are the spiritual characteristics we develop in this world. Like a child in the womb develops, the physical characteristics it's going to need to exist in this world, that there's a parallel between those two things. And that the development of character and how we conduct ourselves in this world is kind of how that workshop is worked out, and how we develop those attributes. And that part of that is a life of service, that how we devote our time and energy and resources in service to our fellow human beings is a big part of how we develop that character. And also our relationship with God through devotions, through prayer, through meditation, through fasting, that these are things that are practices that enable us to grow and put us in contact with our Creator. And prayer may be done in private, it may be done in groups, but those are both beneficial. So there's these aspects of growing spiritually ourselves, but also Baha'u'llah says that our second purpose in life is to contribute to the transformation of society. He said that right now we are in a very tumultuous time, and I mean, that's very obvious to all of us. and that there are really two processes that are happening at one time in the world that are kind of explain this tumult. One is that, as I was saying, the way we have lived for a long, long time, believing that some people are superior to others, some people holding vast amounts of power and economics, and other people having little, is an unsustainable way. And it's not the will of God that we live this way any longer. And so there's kind of this old world order that's crumbling, and it gets a lot of headlines. And then there's this kind of, it's like we look outside right now and all the little green grasses are coming up that have been covered by the snow all winter. And this is what not only Baha'is are engaged worldwide in working on, but all of humanity to one degree or another is working on this. That there is, in the Bahá'í Faith, we have a worldwide community building process that Baha'is in every country in the world are working on. It's a process that is deliberately trying to foster friendship and intimacy with people beyond barriers of race and class, so that prejudices are naturally and organically weakened. It inspires just neighbors to think about each other's needs and look for solutions to our shared problems together. It encourages social discourse on shared issues, not in a way in which we're in conflict with one another and choosing sides, but really trying to understand each other's needs and how we can solve these problems together, and emphasizes the development of children and junior youth and youth. So this is just kind of a process that we are engaged in together as a Baha'i community, but we also invite anybody else to, whether you're Baha'i or not, who is excited about trying to build these things together to be part of this. And so I just wanted to mention a couple of things, that are happening locally, just you might find interesting, and just what's going on in our own community. One example is that Baha'is are holding in very informal settings, just family members or people with their neighbors or with their friends or with their colleagues at work, devotional gatherings that bring people of all different religions together. That's not something we do very much. We have all our individual places of worship. And so we're just inviting people to hold devotions and pray together and have conversation around spiritual things. We also have what we call study circles, where we reflect on various things like the life of the spirit, what our purpose of life really is all about. And there are also junior youth spiritual empowerment processes that are happening. I know in Cedar Rapids, this is happening right now. And then we also have things called firesides, which are really just informal meetings on people that are interested in hearing a little bit more about the Baha'i Faith. So just to kind of wrap up what I'm saying is, what we want to state plainly is the Baha'is don't believe this transformation that we're talking about is going to happen exclusively through our own efforts, that we are also not trying to create a movement that seeks to impose on society our vision of the future. But we really believe that every nation, every group, every individual person is, to a greater or lesser degree right now, contributing to the emergence of this unified world civilization that humanity is working toward. That it's going to be achieved over a long period of time through our efforts in different realms, politically, world undertakings, the races of humanity, which we believe are really one race, but we tend to think about it as multiple races, and the unity of nations. And that as these come to be realized, there will be a politically united world, but in being unified, as Shadden said, it respects the full diversity of cultures and provides channels for the expression of dignity and honor of all individuals, and that it will gradually take shape. So if you would like some more information, there's a couple websites we're mentioning on here. One is for the United States Baha'i website, is just Baha'i.us, BAHAI.us. And then there's a worldwide website, which is Baha'i.org. There's also a film that you could watch if you were interested in more, called The Light to the World. And then if you wanted to just contact anybody, the Iowa City Baha'is can be contacted by icbaha'is@gmail.com.